Hello, and welcome back to Read the Care Tag, a fashion podcast. This podcast is about anything and everything fashion-related, for all of those who never grew out of playing dress-up, with a sprinkle of history, a dabble of pop culture, a healthy dollop of fashion obsession, and a pinch of philosophical questioning. I hope you enjoy the show. My name is Maya, and today's episode is all about my favorite fashion icon, the queen of punk, the lifelong rebel, and one of the biggest forces in the past century of fashion, Dame Vivienne Westwood. Before I get started, I just wanted to apologize for my slightly nasally voice and the late episode. I had a double whammy of a concussion, and then I got super sick for the past 2 weeks, so I'm back, and hopefully I haven't taken too long. Now, without further ado, let's get into the story of Vivienne Westwood. Vivienne was born on April 8th, 1941, and sadly, she left us on the 29th of December, 2022. She was known for many things, but today, most people recognize her trademark Saturn orb logo, especially when set in a choker-length string of pearls. But she was so much more than just a pearl necklace or a Met Gala corset. Vivienne was instrumental in propelling punk and new wave fashions into the mainstream, and she lived her choices unapologetically, with a Cheshire grin stretching from ear to ear, ready to weather any storm. But who was she before all of that? Before the priestess of punk, the luxe galas, and the bright orange hair, Vivienne was born in a small English village to working-class parents amidst World War II. And around when she turned 17, her family moved to the Greater London area. There, she began a jewelry-making course at the University of Westminster, but dropped out after barely a semester because, quote, "I didn't know how a working-class girl like me could possibly make a living in the art world." So instead, Vivienne shifted her gaze to reality. She took a practical job in a factory as she studied to become a teacher. She continued to make her own jewelry as a side gig, which she sold out of a market stall, alongside her teaching career. Soon after, she met Derek Westwood, and they were married in July 1962. Despite the sepia tone this part of her life is often portrayed in, the quote-unquote before she became Vivienne, she was already budding into the legend we know today. Not only was she still making her own design projects, selling jewelry, and becoming a mother, but she even designed and made her own wedding dress. It is important to remember that incredible artists do not become incredible after getting famous. More often than not, the order is reversed, and the proverbial iceberg of their talent starts long before it is recognized. This sort of retroactive attribution is often put onto Vivienne Westwood's career, and I think that we owe it to her and her memory to remind ourselves that she was Vivienne long before she became Vivienne Westwood. Vivienne and Derek shared a son, Benjamin. However, their marriage only lasted about 3 years as they were divorced in 1965. In many discussions of Vivienne's life story, this is viewed as an auspicious turning point. She had rebelled against marital restraints and met Malcolm McLaren, a wannabe punk rock band manager with a mind as quick as his temper. And as they began their tumultuous romance, they, together, heralded in the age of punk in 1960s Britain. Now McLaren, he didn't stay wannabe for long. With Vivienne by his side, he managed bands like the New York Dolls and the Sex Pistols. As the popularity of the bands grew, demand for punk styles that embraced the same spirit grew as well. From 1967 to 1971, Vivienne produced the clothes that McLaren designed for the bands. And as the punk scene continued to develop around them, they opened a store out of the back of 430 Kings Road. This legendary shop came to be known as Let It Rock. It was a place to listen to music, buy records, hang out, and shop for clothes inspired by the stagewear of the bands. The decor looked almost like an old British lady's tea room, and the styles carried leaned more to the teddy boy aesthetic of brothel creeper shoes, frills, and army surplus. But it didn't stay that way for long. In 1973, the store was rechristened Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, mainly selling leatherwear, 50s-inspired, punked-up pin-up clothing. And the name, which was inspired by James Dean, ushered in a new, rugged rock-and-roll era of rebellion, defiance, and skull-and-bone imagery. In 1974, the shop was once again renamed, now to Sex. Sex was a mingling place for all sorts of people, from fringe kink culture to sex workers to punk fashionistas and everyone in between. It marked Vivienne's dive deeper into political art and subversion of the orthodox. Just a couple years later, in 1976, the shop was renamed to Seditionaries. The word sedition means to incite rebellion, and the shop was once again remodeled, now into a brutalist interior distressed with bullet holes and harsh brick lighting. It was a pinnacle point of the fetish punk subversions, with torn pin-up outfits dripping with leather straps and chains. However, just like any trend, the radical views tend to fall away in favor of commercial trend appeal. This led to Vivienne's departure from punk as she shifted her lens over to the past. Vivienne's shift in focus was accompanied by a similar shift in the legendary shop. Its final name was World's End. But in fact, World's End continues to exist today on King's Road. Now, I don't know if it's exactly as it was then, so I'll describe the original decor. It was intended to feel like the belly of an 18th century galleon, a ship that had somehow found space for an old-world curio shop in its bowels. The otherworldly sense was only enhanced by the collection of antiques artfully arranged in a 13-hour clock constantly spinning backwards. It is from this shop that she launched her very first Runway collection, and where the true story of Vivienne Westwood began. Before we get into her rise to fame, I want to take a look at Vivienne through some of her own words. First, this is one of my favorite quotes and something I carry in my personal philosophy. Quote, "All the clothes I wore, people would regard as shocking. I wore them because I thought that I looked like a princess from another planet." So often, people view fashion as a vain practice of attention-seeking, and to that I say, what's wrong with that? Humans are social animals. Without attention, we depressively waste away or slowly lose our minds. It is human nature to desire to be perceived positively and in a way that is true to ourselves. As I discussed in the first episode, even the choice to reject fashion calls attention to itself. At the same time, while fashion may be a method to that end for some, for others, it's a form of artistic expression. Personally, every day I wake up, I feel like a slightly different version of myself. Me, but slightly shifted. Same princess, different planet. Plenty of people struggle to find this balance. The desire to express themselves tempered by fear of negative social feedback. Unsurprisingly, Halloween is a popular excuse to dress up for adults as much as it is for children. It's one of the few times a year that it's acceptable to wear whatever you want. I think that Vivienne chose to live life like an eternal Halloween and dress up as herself every single day. Vivienne is viewed as a symbol of female freedom and strength, rebelling against societal expectations of what a woman should be, regardless of age, appearance, or anything else. However, her strengths do not negate the difficulties she experienced throughout her life and her own complicated relationship with herself. She was no stranger to struggle. Despite her talent, she had felt unable to break free of the socioeconomic bounds keeping her from pursuing art. And once she had finally veered off of the traditional path she had been following, she still felt kept by McLaren, that he controlled her potential future more than she did. In turn, he used her emotional turmoil to fuel his artistic self and make himself feel big by making her feel small. Vogue interviewed Vivienne after McLaren had passed, and she said, "He had this thing where he couldn't leave the flat until he had made me cry. It was simpler to give in, give way to tears so he would stop. Real tears have never come back to me. I haven't cried properly since." My love for Vivienne is the reason I'm referring to McLaren by his last name throughout this episode, and to Vivienne by her first. Despite his talent and artistry, I don't want to give him the kindness of familiarity in this story. Their own son reinforces this image of McLaren as a bully who had a toxic need to make Vivienne cry in order for him to feel the feelings he needed to feel. He also held his power over her. As a link between her and the art world, he almost lorded his ability to affect her success over her. And Vivienne said that she, quote, felt that there were so many doors to open, and he had the key to all of them. Despite my disdain for his character and treatment of Vivienne and their son, sometimes we have to separate the art from the artist to delve into the full story. McLaren was a true rebel and absorbed the wild nature of rock in all aspects of his life. He rebelled against popular music and fashion trends of the hippy-dippy 70s, opting instead to revive the 1950s/60s teddy boy styles, which originated in the rock and roll subculture with inspiration from Edwardian dandies. In fact, some of the first styles sold at Let It Rock were brothel creepers shoes that were popularized by this subculture. This is probably a good moment to let my audio podcast listeners know that I'm also uploading the podcast on YouTube, but with accompanying video showing everything that I'm talking about. If you're not able to check it out on YouTube or you prefer to listen on Spotify, you can also check out the Instagram at ReadTheCareTag to see some of the stuff that I'm talking about in today's episode. Now, if you are here with me on YouTube, let's take a look at these creepers. Do they remind you of anything? The name maybe? Puma creepers? Anyone? Bit of a detour from this point in Vivienne's life, but I just want to use the opportunity to highlight how fashion constantly self-references and how the popularization of certain styles has to do with the state of the world around them. Even these creepers were born as a result of post-war hunger for unnecessary ornation after an extended period of hardship worldwide. In the next episode, I'll be diving into the Russian subculture of styliagi, whose hunger for rock and roll and forbidden Western culture led them to create homemade versions of these shoes too. Now back to the story. The early 1980s were an important point in Vivienne's life. As McLaren shifted more and more into the music side of things, Vivienne began to come into her own as a designer. As I said earlier, the commercial absorption of punk trends led Vivienne into the past. From this was born her very first runway collection, Spring 1981's Pirates. She was inspired by all manner of piracy, with dandified criminal inspiration like highwaymen and buccaneers. All of the items were unisex, and the collection marked the dawn of her commercial success. New romanticism and nostalgia were in the air. The departure from punk still embraced the extreme and outrageous just the same, but in a more positive, effervescent, and playful way. When interviewed about this collection, Vivienne said this, quote, "The 80s will be a technological age for which we need to equip ourselves with the feeling of human warmth from past ages, of culture taken from the time of pirates and Louis XIV. Now for the YouTube-only exclusive side of things, let's get into some of these looks. The first look we are looking at is an ensemble of a yellow jacket and yellow pants with tailoring inspiration. The patterned dress shirt and matching scarf around the waist carry a classic motif that eventually became a Vivienne Westwood house code. The look is rounded out by a black bicorn hat, a black vest, and matching black leather square-toe boots. The vents in the sleeves are also something that follows through in the rest of this collection. And while that look is very evidently pirate-like, we can take a look at the buccaneer look as well, which continues the same concept while remaining much more wearable. A plaid wool overcoat with red sleeve vents continues the theme of suiting and historical inspiration. With the success of her first collection, Vivienne searched deeper into history and culture with concepts based around ethnic imagery sourced from National Geographic's and museum archives. McLaren referenced this period by saying, quote, "We relate ourselves to those taboos and magical things we believe we have lost." This period birthed the second Westwood collection for spring-summer 1982 called Savage. which combined indigenous people's motifs with French military caps, or Foreign Legion caps, along with bloomers, and more and more and more. The geometric prints, synonymous with the 80s, and bowler hats made simple silhouettes sing with joy. And the square-toe shoes we saw in the pirate collection began to settle into another house code for Vivienne, known as the hammerhead shoes. The eclectic nature of this collection makes it hard to describe, so I really recommend you joining me on YouTube to see the collection along with the story. I'll take a pause here to address the nature of the appropriation of cultural and ethnic patterns in fashion. Although today these things would not be viewed as acceptable, at the time the absorption of cultural imagery in Western art was no new thing, and viewed more as a tribute. Now, it's not an excuse as much as it is an explanation of the circumstances that birthed these sorts of collections. Personally, I think it is important to involve cultural elements in fashion and art in order to imbue meaning beyond simply being a pretty thing. But it is important to do so respectfully, with meaning and credit, as well as knowing the line between tribute and appropriation. Because that line is so fine, I would always err on the side of caution and take inspiration from personal connection to culture rather than searching for those sources in someone else's. However, art is eternally self-referential, and policing it is against the very nature of art. But going back to the collection, I think calling it savage was not the most tasteful, as it perpetuates the colonial narrative of non-Western cultures being less civilized. But that's just my 2 cents. Don't mind me. Next came Nostalgia of Mud, Autumn-Winter 1982. This is one of my personal favorite collections, which marked the beginning of Vivienne's embrace of British history, with tattered skirts, wool, sheepskin, and a sheen of dirt covering everything. Vivienne also related the collection to early colonial America, with a Western jig performed halfway through the runway, buffalo hats and bustle skirts evoking a decidedly Wild West energy amidst core British elements. Spring-summer 1983's punk couture used inspirations for the Blade Runner movie and brought their punk history into the couture sphere. Giant top hats, metallic fabrics, and historical silhouettes and Blade Runner imagery gave the show an otherworldly feel, with the models taking theatrical tiptoes across the stage to the sound of a hard electronic beat. Around this time, McLaren and Vivienne opened a second shop called Nostalgia of Mud. The interior design was incredible. Just like with Let It Rock, aka Sex, aka World's End, they went all out. In this case, it was made to look like an archaeological dig, and it blew visitors away. I won't lie, I do wish I could have visited these shops. Truly, something we rarely see today, and although millions of gimmicky shops exist, this was more like an art exhibition. The delve into taboo didn't end there for Vivienne. Her and McLaren's next collection for Autumn-Winter 1983 was called Witches. Vivienne had fallen in love with New York City graffitiist Keith Haring's style of symbols, which were involved in the set design. The silhouettes returned to the teddy boy girl origin of tube skirts and oversized jackets, combined with witchy knitted jacquard and pointed hats, as well as shoes featuring 3 tongues. This was the last collection birthed from Vivienne and McLaren together. Just like all their other ventures, it was never just about the clothes. The stage the clothes danced on, the music to which they danced, and the light that flickered above were all part of the show. At this point, Vivienne was growing out of her Kings Road shop. In 1984, she moved to Italy and began to experiment with synthetic fabrics, athletic materials, and neon craziness, and then to an otherworldly Wild West through the Clint Eastwood collection. Over the second half of the 1980s, Vivienne developed the true ethos of the brand we know and love today, along with many of the house codes we see throughout her designs. The Mini Crinny collection of 85 went for the opposite of the, at the time, popular shoulder pad, narrow hip styles of the 80s, instead opting for historical inspiration with a combination of a tutu and Victorian crinoline. At the same time, she was embracing what the 80s styles were returning, using clothing to change the shape of the body. she simply wanted to change it in a different way. Vivienne also embraced the combination of childishness and sexiness in the refusal to grow up, which I have also wholeheartedly embraced. The involvement of English history in her designs that is now viewed as a Westwood house code solidified its place in her brand with the 1987 Harris Tweed collection. It was named after a specific tweed wool fabric hand-woven in Western Scotland. Even the Saturn orb logo comes from the Harris Tweed Authority logo. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm pulling them up here so that you can see just how similar they are, but you can also check it out on Instagram. The Harris Tweed Authority logo is pretty much exactly the same as her logo, but a couple degrees less stylized and minus the Saturn ring. Her collections from 1988 to 1990 became collectively known as Britain Must Go Pagan, where she further dove into British history but combined recent historical elements with further European pagan symbolism from long before Britain existed as it does today. It was essentially her love letter to the dichotomy between tradition and rebellion, which permeated all of her work. Her eternal playfulness also added a relaxed element, reminding us that at the end of the day, this is a parody of all of these things. In the Time Machine collection, she mixed strict suits in Harris tweed with sculpted jackets modeled after medieval armor. Then, in Pagan 5, she turned to 18th century fashion and classical Rome with a futuristic twist. As she became more and more interested in history and art, these topics became intertwined with her design aesthetic. In 1990, her portrait collection continued these lines with structured, exaggerated garments printed with the images of 18th century art on them. Although we see imitations of these rampant on sites like Shein, she spent hours poring over French art collections in her research for this collection. This was also the collection where models emerged in 10-inch platforms, placing them on pedestals, just like marble sculptures in a museum. In fact, this is that iconic collection in which Naomi Campbell tumbled off of those 10-inch platforms. Over the next 20 years, she put a lot of time and effort into sourcing traditional British woolen fabrics, as she believed that the feel of the clothes is just as important as the look. Another side of this was Scottish tartans. From the ripped-up kilts filling the original Let It Rock shop to custom-designed tartans by Lochran of Scotland, she never let go of this pinnacle of tradition and rebellion print. Although she continued experimenting with structure, she became more involved in draping and freeform cutting in the 2000s. Despite this, corsets in all forms have continued to be a hallmark of a Westwood collection, taking a symbol of restriction from being hidden away to being worn on top. Her romance with history only continues to become more involved as she takes inspiration of the Tudor slash and pull methods, which were a masculine style in which slits would be cut in fabric to reveal brightly colored fabric pulled through from underneath. Vivienne subverts this by making extremely beautiful and feminine garments, but omitting the underlining, allowing the flesh to peek out. She, of course, also involved unconventional materials like denim and thick cotton twills. Vivienne has also continued to involve knitwear, but focused it mainly in menswear, and experimented with a variety of methods. In a similar vein, she brings traditional men's tailoring into the woman's wear side of things. In 2006, Vivienne was made a dame for services to British culture via fashion, and she was truly a force within the fashion industry. She famously went commando, never accepting that getting older meant you had to be more restrained in what you wore and who you are. She has truly been such an inspiration to me, and the grace with which she has grown throughout her career is what I aspire towards. Vivienne's biggest contribution was her belief that clothing has a real power for change, changing how you feel, how you think, how others around you think. And specifically, it's the uniqueness, the specialness of an item that gives it this magical power. Vivienne was self-taught and continued her lifelong learning until the day she died. Through each of her collections, she took us along on that journey with her. And her brand has remained independent, and she remained involved in every single part of it. Vivienne famously said around the time of the Pirate collection's success, quote, "I realized I could do anything I liked. It was only a question of how I did it that would make it original. I realized that I could go on forever." Vivienne received countless awards for her work, including several Designer of the Year awards, an OBE, and the Queen's Award for Export Achievement. One of my favorite quotes of hers is, quote, "Fashion for me is like walking a tightrope. You risk falling off into the ridiculous, but if you can stay on that tightrope, you can achieve a triumph." I love this tightrope dance, and the hilarity of fashion brings me joy. Vivienne's overall attitude to fashion always reflected this unseriousness. The idea was a creation of your own personal propaganda. Who you are and who the world will see you as is your choice. The feeling of the clothes, as well as the feeling in the clothes, is the magic of it all. Using historical references is a part of weaving the past into the future and remembering those who came before us. Reflecting human nature and experience in your own nature and experience. Especially valuable, I believe, is the appreciation for beauty and art that history holds. It reminds us how important these things are to history, despite the modern condescension of these pursuits as vain and shallow. Vivienne is my icon. It is a personal mourning for me that I'll never get a chance to meet her. I dreamed of working under her, and that chance will never come. When I found out that she had died, I was on a little boat in the middle of a big ocean, and I could feel the impact of her loss. An artistic chameleon who changed color 1,000,000 times throughout her life, but never changed her shape. Thank you so much for joining me on Read the Care Tag. Please forgive me for being sick. I'm sorry. I hope my voice will be back to normal next week. And if you're interested into a dive into some of her more recent collections, let me know, and I'll definitely do an episode on that in the future. Follow the Instagram at Read the Care Tag for photos of some of the stuff I talked about today, or check it out on YouTube to get to see videos of the collections and photos as I discuss it. Please follow the show and review it to let me know what you think of my rambling, and the sources are linked in the description. I hope you have a lovely week, and I'll see you next time on Read the Care Tag.